Today, I'm discussing two movements that should already be pretty familiar to you: Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. This is what many people begin to consider true modern art. First up is Impressionism, which lasted from about 1860 to about 1880. Here are the characteristics: a contemporary social life focus, especially on the middle class at leisure, glimpses or fleeting impressions of a scene, painters experimenting with light and viewpoint, figures and objects having no hard or harsh outlines, no dark colors, or especially no black, and no shading. Compositions are often cropped. So the Impressionists were big on painting technique, and here's what they did to deviate from the norm. They chose essence over detail. They put on globs of paint on the canvas. Colors were placed side by side rather than mixed together. Wet on wet paint, which was a huge, giant, big no-no in the art world before then. A lot of paintings were done in the early morning or the late evening to capture the golden hour, and there was a semi-attempt at realism. So Impressionism kind of got its start at the Salon des Refusés. So the original Salon in Paris was a kind of gallery of sorts that played host to what they considered to be the best art at the time. Hundreds of artists would submit their works every year in the hopes of being premiered at the Salon. Only the artists who adhered to the Salon's strict standards could be accepted to show them. There was a high number of rejects of the Salon in 1863. Napoleon heard about the rejects and was a bit offended, so he wanted to create a new space for them away from the Salon, called the Salon des Refusés. This was a place for the rejects of the Salon to show their art. Among those rejected were future legends like Degas, Monet, and Cézanne. The first show of this new Salon was held in a photo gallery in 1874. So one of the best known artists of the Impressionistic movement was Claude Monet. His painting Impression Sunrise from 1872 was considered to be the first work of Impressionistic art. Many people believe that it was actually this piece that kick-started the Impressionistic movement. Berthe Morisot was one of the many other artists to be rejected from the Salon. At one point, she had actually been one of the artists to show at the Salon, but she later began to change her style and decided to join in with the other artists at the Salon des Refusés. Jeune femme assise à bois de Boulogne, painted in 1885, is one of her few fully developed paintings. Perhaps the most famous female impressionist was Mary Cassatt. She was an American living in France and had a passion for painting mothers and their children. She wanted to capture the everyday, more natural and untouched reality of motherhood and childhood. This is seen really well in Young Mother Sewing from 1900. So sculpture was becoming less and less common, but the Impressionists still managed to have a sculptor among their ranks. Auguste Rodin was an Impressionist sculptor. He cast in bronze what the Impressionist painters put on canvas. He is probably most famous for his sculpture called The Thinker, which was originally actually called The Poet. It was first cast in 1902, and since then, multiple copies of various different sizes of it have been made. So that's it for Impressionism. I realize there are about 50 more artists I could talk about, but we just don't have that kind of time. On to Post-Impressionism. So Post-Impressionism started in about 1880 and ended around 1905. Yay for making it out of the 19th century. So there are no characteristics for this movement. I don't know what else to tell you. They really just started each doing their own individual thing. Moving on. Like the Impressionists, Post-Impressionists were a little too focused on being very French and France-centered. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, a very French man, was one such painter. He was a member of the French upper class and was obsessed with hanging out at the Moulin Rouge. He painted various scenes of the dance hall, and he always painted them at really odd angles. If you've ever seen a film and seen it kind of like tilt, it's called a Dutch tilt. He did that, but with painting. He would also flood the scene with the artificial light that was often present at the Moulin Rouge, and it would dye the white painted faces of the dancers all these weird, unnatural colors. Later, his poster art actually became his signature. Georges Seurat spent years studying optical sciences to perfect his new style called pointillism. A Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of the Grand Jatte, finished in 1884, is perhaps his most famous work using this technique. It even inspired its own musical called Sunday in the Park with George. Circus Sideshow is also a really famous work of his. It depicts a really common scene that you would see on the streets of Paris late at night. So Seurat had a lot of contemporaries, mainly Signac, and they followed in his footsteps of creating mostly pointillism paintings. He kind of started his own movement. Vincent van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh, if not the most famous artist in the world, is at the very least the most famous post-impressionistic painter. He equated color to emotion, painting in shades that reflected how he felt at the time of creating them. He painted it in a style called impasto, which is dabbing really thick globs of oil paint onto this canvas in order to create really rapid movement and depth. He made over 860 oil paintings and 1,300 watercolors, but he never sold more than one painting in his lifetime. His most famous painting is Starry Night, which we are most fortunate to have here in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. Paul Gauguin was not like other post-impressionists. He hated Paris. He ran from it screaming, probably. He painted in bright, flat colors. He spent a majority of his time in tropical islands, getting to know the locals and painting them with really artificial colors. The first artist to really move away from depicting objective reality was Cézanne. He adhered to the idea that the world could be represented in a series of shapes, like spheres, cubes, and cones. Mont Sainte-Victoire, a local mountain, was what he used to experiment with this idea, and he would often repeatedly paint the mountain and its surrounding village. Even when representing people, like in The Card Players, Cézanne chose to use these forms rather than depicting them accurately. He is thought by many to be the first true modern artist. And that's it. Again, I could go on and on for ages about so many more artists in each of these time periods, but this video just doesn't have time for that. I hope you enjoyed my second installment in my Capstone project, and I'll see you guys in 3 weeks. Bye!